right, everyone, welcome to the second Tuesday Times Roundtable of the academic year. We can all be together for a brief 1 hour reprieve from worrying about Hurricane Irma together. I'm happy to introduce today's moderator. Diana Dabek is a PhD candidate in the Department of English at the University of Miami, where she specializes in early American literature. She's currently working on her dissertation titled Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Theater, Women Dramatists and the Early Republican Stage. In it, she examines how early American women dramatists utilized the stage to combat gendered notions of citizenship in the early national period. Diana is also a proud alumna of Florida International University, where she graduated with a BA in English and a master's in literature. Over the years, she has maintained close ties to her alma mater by teaching courses in literature and composition, participating in FIU's global learning initiatives through things like this, and by most recently serving as a mentor for FIU's dual enrollment program. Thanks for being here.
Okay, great. So let me just kind of adjust over here. Can everyone hear me in the back? Yes? Okay, excellent. So I'd like to start by thanking the Office of Global Learning for putting together an event like this. I think it's extremely important for us to have an opportunity as faculty and students to get together to discuss some important topics like this, like censorship, right? And of course, thank you to all of you for being here today after an extended long weekend. And as Eric mentioned, prior to a hurricane that may possibly be hitting us, I appreciate that you're taking the time out of your busy schedules to be here with me today. So as Eric mentioned, I am a PhD student. So what that means is that I care an awful lot about books, right? So books are my livelihood. And not only that, I enjoy reading books, right? So my research focuses primarily on theatrical works that have been banned, right? So I'm interested in understanding why the theater was such a kind of contested space in early American culture. More importantly, what types of works were being banned, and also how censorship and banning kind of shaped the literary canon, right? So those are questions that I'm interested in exploring. So I'm hoping that then you can see the connection between the New York Times article that I've selected for today and my own research interests, right? So there should be some sort of kind of alignment between the two. So of course, I chose this article for two reasons. One, it aligns with my research interests. And two, because I think that we should be talking about censorship, right? I think that there's a lot that's been going on in the press recently, and I think that this gives rise to a lot of important and timely conversations that we should be having, right? Okay, so as we all know, there are different types of censorship, right? So different modes of censoring and also different things that get censored, right? So anything from the theater to books to films, right? Broadcasting, all of these things have been subject to censorship at some point in time, right? However, for the purpose of our conversation, we're going to be focusing exclusively on print censorship. So I'd like to kind of have you guys kind of redirect your attention to just that specific mode of censorship, right? In print, in books, right? Okay. So when people think about censorship, usually the first thing that comes to mind is kind of really violent acts of keeping text away from people, right? And one of those ways is to burn books, right? So book burning is something that is actually pretty relevant and prevalent in our culture. It has been happening in our country from the colonial era all the way up until now, right? There's actually a lot of institutions, both religious and also organizations by different groups of people that get together for book burning. However, the image that I have here is from a actually very important time in history where students from New York's St. Patrick's School gathered together in 1948 to burn comic books, right? So there was this kind of real fear that comic books were spreading depravity, right? That comic books were making people more aggressive, and that actually some comic books were espousing homosexuality, right? So there's a lot of kind of misinformation that goes into censoring, right? And people oftentimes act out of fear, right? So this is, again, the most kind of violent mode of censorship, right? And of course, in reality, censorship is a little bit more complex, right? This is a photograph taken at a court hearing that had to do with censorship. It's in 1955 when Allen Ginsberg published his poem Howl. And just a few days after he did his reading, he was arrested in San Francisco, okay? Because people thought that his poetry was extremely obscene, right? So after a long trial, it was finally ruled that Howl was not obscene and that it was allowed to be circulated and published and enjoyed by the general public. However, I want you to think that censorship is actually a quite sinister act that involves a lot of different parties, right? Not just individuals like we saw in the first picture, but also just more organizations and people that are kind of partaking in these types of censoring, right? So I ask you, when I say censorship, what are some of the things that come to mind? What are some of the kind of first thoughts that pop into your head? Yes?
Kind of like when you're watching TV.
Okay, so censorship, whether that be in the airwaves or in television. Okay, what else? What are some of the other kind of things that you can think of? Yep. Okay, so maybe very specific laws related to language and what can or cannot be said in state institution or state supported agencies, okay? Okay, yeah, so there's kind of a lot of different ways of thinking about censorship, right? So according to the American Library Association, they define censorship as a suppression of ideas and information that certain persons, individuals, groups, or government officials find objectionable or dangerous, right? So I'd like for you to kind of spend a moment here in thinking about how censorship is enacted not just by one person, right? Not just by the government, not just by organizations, but by all of the above, right? Oftentimes it's happened. Thus, censorship is a change in the access status of material based on the content of the work and made by a governing authority or its representatives. So what that means is that censorship changes who has access to what, right? So we all know that Courtney's saying that knowledge is power, right? I mean, it truly is, right? So if you are denied access to certain information, you then become ignorant, right, in that scope. So it's important for us to kind of understand what's at stake here, right? The fact that censorship changes who has access to what. More importantly, going along with the previous point, censorship is an issue of power, right? So censors try to use the power of the state to impose their views on what is truthful, appropriate, offensive on the general public, right? So again, kind of thinking about this being a tug of war of power, right? So who has the power to say what? Who has the power to tell whose story, right? And also who has agency, right? So censorship removes agency from people. So that's also something I'd like for you guys to think about, right? Okay, so going back to what we were talking about, right? There's different forms of censorship, right? There's the banning of a book, right? And that means when you're removing it from a public space like a library, right? So when you're physically taking the book out of circulation. There's something called redacting, and that's what we have here on the image to the right. And that's basically when we are blackening out or deleting information in a text, right? So when you are selectively censoring material within a text. There's something called labeling, right? So according to the ALA, it's not okay to use prejudicial labels. By that, they mean labels that restrict access based on value judgment, language, or themes of a book. Right? So you're not allowed to label according to these things, right? And you're also not allowed to label if you think it's inappropriate or offensive to a specific age group, right? Or population. That's also considered censorship. Restricting, right? So according to the LAA, the restriction of books due to content is a form of censorship, right? Because it impedes certain groups of people from having access to those books. Relocating, right? So a lot of people think, well, if a book is moved from, let's say, young adult section into the adult section, that's not censorship. Well, actually it is, right? Because you are taking you're making a decision from someone else, right? You're telling them what they can or can't read, right? And that information should be open for people to decide, right? And self-censor what they want to read, right? It's not your choice to make as a librarian or as a teacher, right? And then finally, of course, vandalizing, right? So book burning, cutting book pages out of books so that you don't get the whole story, literally, right? These are all also different modes of censorship. So are you guys familiar with any of these? Have you encountered any modes of censorship maybe in your schools in the past where a book wasn't allowed to be taught? Or maybe you've gone to a library and asked for a book only to find out that they don't carry it. Is that something that you have experienced yourselves as readers and scholars? Yes.
I did learn quite recently that the Anne Frank book
Mm-hmm.
is really censored.
Very much so.
I remember reading, the version that they gave me in middle school years ago. And then I'm traveling, talking to my friends about Anne Frank, and we're discussing these things that I'm like, wait, I don't remember reading those things.
Okay.
Then they lend me the book, and it's like, what version is this?
Mm-hmm.
What just happened?
Right. Okay, so
Yeah.
different editions, right? So different editions choose and pick what they want to include or leave out, right? And that might be geared towards specific audiences, specific age groups, if you read that book when you were much younger, right? So that's an excellent example, right? So yeah, so we're on good standing ground. I think if a lot of us haven't encountered books that have pages ripped out of them, or you haven't seen, fire blazing with books, I think we're on the right track. However, it's important to note that these things are still happening, right? Okay, so because we have such a kind of strong and long history with censorship here in the United States, I think it might be important to kind of pause for a second and to go over how censorship has evolved in America over the centuries. And I'd like to begin, of course, in the very beginning, in colonial America, right? So the first book to have ever been banned in colonial America in 1650 was The Meritorious Price of a Redemption by William Pynchon. And this book was deemed inappropriate and offensive on the grounds that it refuted the Puritan doctrine of atonement, right? So here we see censorship based on religious beliefs, right? So that's something that we're using to limit knowledge, right? Or different points of view or opinions on religion, right? And this was done at the state level, right? So the Massachusetts General Court ruled that all copies should be burned in the center of the marketplace in Boston, right? So again, going back to the idea that if we are able to make an example of this text, and if we're able to remove it from the hands of the people, then other authors should be scared and won't be publishing these types of texts, right? Okay, so as we get into the 19th century, censorship starts to develop, right? So we see other groups getting involved with censorship, most notably the Postal Service. So, for example, in the years leading up to the Civil War, the Postal Service in the southern states refused to carry or distribute any books that had an abolitionist point of view, right? So imagine getting the mail and having it be censored by someone else, right? Having them decide what you can or can't read and what they think is suitable for their citizens, right? And that's, of course, very problematic, right? And these states, right, the southern states would later ban one of the most popular books of the 19th century, which is Uncle Tom's Cabin, right, which was by Harriet Beecher Stowe. So in 1852, this would become the first book in the United States to experience a ban on a national scale, right? So it started with states in the South who did not want this text to be read, of course, because it depicted the horrors of slavery. And then it kind of worked its way up into other groups of people who believed that this book was too risky, whether it be for language or content, right, sexuality, what have you, right? But the point is that this would be the first book in the United States to experience a ban on the national scale, right? And then eventually the Confederacy would bar this book from bookstores in southern states and even encourage public burnings of the text, right? So again, we see the state stepping in and kind of taking ownership of literature and how it's distributed amongst its citizens, right? So that's also something to keep an eye out for, right? Okay, so let's go on to the next point. So censorship in 19th century America would continue to escalate, right? So by the time we get to 1873, Congress would pass the Comstock Act. And this is really interesting, I think, and it gets us thinking about censorship and in terms of gender, right? And how there's a relationship between those two. So what this act did was it made a punishable crime to publish or distribute materials that could be used for, quote, unlawful abortion or contraception, right? So what happens then is that all of these texts have to do with the human anatomy, right, with the female body, scientific studies, illustrations, right? All of these get taken out of the hands of the public, right, out of fear that women will be able to then have some sort of knowledge about reproduction, right? And the law, as it says here, banned any and all written or printed cards, circular books, pamphlets, or advertisements, right? So they covered all grounds, right? Not just books, anything that had some sort of literary kind of content to it, right? That directly or indirectly, right? And that's also important to note, right? So it's not just that you're making an overt statement about maybe the female reproductive system. It's if you maybe are mentioning something that sounds like you shouldn't be mentioning, you're probably going to have your book censored, right? Or banned, or just not distributed by the Postal Service, right? So again, the act would ban the distribution of these materials, and of course also the importation of other texts from abroad, right? So there's kind of a wide range of censorship that's going on. So I'm interested to know, why do you think this act here in 1873 was so powerful? And I mean, you don't have to know much history about it, but why do you think, they would go out of their way to ban or censor these types of books? Yes.
It's so powerful because the government defines the range of what the word obscene means. So as long as they control the extent of what is obscene and what is not obscene, they could regulate things that could actually just be harmless.
Right.
Since we've progressed from thinking like this, that goes to show that, that isn't the most ideal thing to do. So I think nowadays, people try to in law, they try to not try to be as nitpicky about the term obscene, but there's still that doubt, what range does it include? Okay, because we have ratings on movies, on video games, but there's always that exception that maybe someone is actually they can be exposed to that age, or someone's mature. So I guess it's up to interpretation, and as long as the government controls that, there's always that fear that maybe they got too far.
Right, good, right? So obscenity, right, or the word obscene it's very much subjective, right? And that becomes problematic when the government yields power over that word, right? And then is able to pass laws or limit the distribution of books based on that definition, right? What else is going on in the late 1800s in America? What are some of the things that come to mind as to why this particular act might have popped up and done so well? Yeah. Okay.
They wanted to keep everything institutionalized. They got people coming from other countries that have different cultures, and they wanted to keep that assimilation of the American, what the American culture was, and they needed to keep that within the schools. And when these books came out, they were thinking, oh, there's other things outside the box, and they don't want to keep them. They wanted to keep it domesticated.
Okay, so maybe domesticate the ideas based on human anatomy. Yeah, go even to that extent. What else? Let's think kind of in the broad scheme. What are some of the most important movements that are happening in America in this time period? Yes. Women's suffrage, right? Of course, right? So if we have women that are starting to ask for the right to vote, right? Women that are asking for the right to contraception, right? Women that are asking the right to have knowledge about their bodies, then what better timing to tell them no, right, than now? Right, so this is kind of, if you think about timing, it's very important to see in that manner as well, right? The fact that politically there was a lot going on that gave fuel and rise to this particular movement, and then that allowed it to pass into law, right? Okay, great. Okay, so I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about censorship in the 20th century and kind of telling you a little bit about some of the important decisions that happened in this time period, some of the important movements, organizations that were part of the history that we're talking about here. So in 1920, 25, we have the Gitlow versus New York case. And this was a U.S. Supreme Court that ruled that the U.S. Constitution's First Amendment, protection of free speech, right, which states that the federal Congress should make no law abridging in the freedom of speech, also apply to state governments, right? This is very, very important, right? Because it means that the state, right, does not have the right to kind of step over the boundary of the First Amendment, right? So that particular policy is a blanket statement, right? Something that is applicable to everyone, not just kind of in terms of the federal state, but also at the state level. And that's very important, right? Then we have the United States versus one book called Ulysses. And this was actually a result of the New York Society for Suppression of Vice, which successfully blocked the publication of Joyce's Ulysses. So how many of you have read that text before? Okay, Ulysses, right. Okay, so it's a very important text, right? It's very rich in history, and it's also a very important part of our literary canon, right? And the reason why, again, that this book was banned was because they were citing it as an obscene piece of literature, right? And it wouldn't be until 1933 that ruling would be overturned, and that book would then be allowed to be distributed and read in the States, right? So again, this case helps us to better define what is obscene and what is not, right? And meaning that the courts cannot issue a ruling based on their perception of obscenity, right? Okay. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the New York Society for the Suppression of Vice, because the two go hand in hand, right, with the decision that we have here on the book challenge and the society themselves. So basically what happens is that this is a grassroots movement that took over, in essence, the city of New York in the 1930s under the leadership of John Saxon Sumner. And actually what happened in 1935 was that he, along with the New York City police, burned over $150,000 worth of books, okay, that were considered to be obscene. Right, so just to give you an idea of the magnitude and the scope of these kind of attempts to censor, right? Not only are they costly, but they're also kind of operating at the state level, right? And they're able to confiscate texts that they deem to be obscene and to kind of take them out of the hands of the public, right? Then we have the Office of War Information, the OWI, during World War II, and this was during the 1940s. And basically what they did is that they gave strict instructions on proper handling of news, right? So you were told if you were if you worked for a newspaper or you were a reporter and you were doing some field work, that whatever information is that you were bringing back and that you were going to be publishing, it had to meet patriotic standards, right? So you had to be patriotic about your point of view, right? Not only that, but you also had to be optimistic about the war, right? So again, we see how censorship is operating here in terms of how information is relayed to the general public as well, right? And then we have the Comics Code Authority, CCA, and the driving force behind the CCA was the fear that the violence in comics might turn children into criminals, basically. So they feared that comic books encouraged deviant sexual behavior, it encouraged people to be aggressive, and again, going back to what I said earlier, some people were even making the claim that Batman and Robin were encouraging homoeroticism, right? So we again see how point of view really dominates censorship, right? And how it's oftentimes the root of all evil when it comes to some of the movements that we see happening here. Okay, so censorship has developed quite a bit from what we looked at then and now. So there have been some notable shifts in censorship and book banning attempts over the last 50 years or so. Contemporary censorship has been moved out of the hands, of course, of the federal and state government and into the hands of the masses, right? So we're seeing a shift from censorship happening at the state level and now having it happen at the hands of individuals, right? People who feel like things are offensive, whether that be parents or teachers that don't want to teach a specific book, right? This is really where censorship attempts are happening right now in contemporary America, right? So again, in today's society, book bans and challenges are usually enacted by private citizens and non-government agencies. Movements, as you'll see in a minute, are less organized and widespread. So that means that You'll have maybe a school in South Florida that decides that they don't want to teach Huckleberry Finn, right? And maybe you'll have a couple more in South Carolina that agree with that point of view, right? But it's not as common as it was before that you'll see a widespread ban of these texts, right? It's much more regionalized and localized now. And the most common way to censor is, of course, to limit distribution or to constrain access to certain texts. And as a result of this, the main target of these challenges are usually public schools and libraries, right? So this is where the focus of would-be censors is, right? Trying to restrict access to these texts, whether that be at a public library or at a public school, right? So kind of getting their hands in that specific spot. Okay, and I think it's important to kind of distinguish the difference between book banning and challenging a book, right? Because they're a little bit different, and sometimes people kind of use the two terms interchangeably, but there is a kind of a distinction between the two. So according to the ALA, a challenge is an attempt to remove or restrict materials based upon the objections of a person or group. A banning is a removal of those materials. Challenges do not simply involve a person expressing a point of view. Rather, they're an attempt to remove material from the curriculum or library, thereby restricting access. Due to the commitment of librarians, teachers, and parents, and other concerned citizens, most challenges are unsuccessful, right? So there's definitely a difference between the two, right? So a challenge aims to remove or restrict, right? And a ban really means to kind of just get rid of completely. Right, so the one is a little bit more lenient, the other is much more harsh, right? So as we kind of keep these words in mind, as we kind of go forward with our discussion, I think that would be important. Okay, so who attempts to censor things today, right? So you might be wondering, well, censorship still happens, right? Who in the world is trying to censor books, right? And in a time of, the internet, podcast, and seemingly unlimited and free access to information, a lot of people are surprised to learn that people are still trying to censor literature, right? So citizens, right, private citizens oftentimes organize groups to ban books, right? So that's like PABIS, and that stands for Parents Against Bad Books in Schools, right? So you might be wondering, what are bad books, right? Well, according to these parents, a lot of books are bad books, right? So groups like this try to ban books from schools, right, and from curriculum. Then you have schools, right? So maybe a school district will make a decision to not adopt a specific text or to not make a mandatory reading because they fear having some sort of backlash from parents, right? So schools will oftentimes self-censor, right, in hopes of avoiding any conflict with the community. And then we have teachers, right? So teachers yield a lot of power in the classroom, right? Oftentimes they decide what kind of books are being taught to students, or at least they're, if not deciding, they're taking part in that decision, right? So when you have a teacher who says, you know what, I don't really want to teach Harry Potter because I don't want to get into a discussion about magic, right? Because it doesn't align with my point of view in terms of Christianity. Right, that is an attempt to self-censor, right, and to restrict access to students based on your point of view or your opinion, right? Okay, so why do people challenge books, right? So we kind of talked about that briefly, but I'd like to get into it a little bit more. And I think it's always important to try to put ourselves in the shoes of other people, right? So would-be censors challenge books believe that censorship could really improve society, right? So from their perspective, they're trying to protect children or help restore morality to the United States, right? They're doing this out of their goodness of their hearts, right? So that's how they view it, right? That's how would-be censors view censorship, right? As something that's going to generate a good public result, right? And some of the common reasons that they cite for censoring things are racial issues, right? They find maybe books that encourage alternative lifestyles, sexual content, violence. You'd be surprised. Some people say that book is too negative, right? And I don't want it taught in my classroom, right? So I didn't feel happy at the end. So that's also a reason for banning a book. References to witchcraft, exploration of non-mainstream religion, right? Political bias, all of these are kind of reasons that people cite when challenging a book, right? And of course, as you see, they're varied, and of course, they're very subjective, right? So something that seems to encourage an alternative lifestyle might seem that way to you, but not to me, right? So that's also important to keep in mind. Okay, so who does this affect? And really, it's important to understand that this affects everyone, right? In the last few decades, young adult authors have been a target of would-be censors, right? So maybe, Judy Blume, Harry Potter, right? All of these books that are kind of geared towards younger readers, that's where most of the censorship tries to happen. That's where most of the censors try to kind of do their work, right? There has also been an increase in challenges to books that express diversity of ideas and viewpoints. And ALA's Office for Intellectual Freedom, right? So what they're doing is that they've been keeping track of challenges and bannings of books from the 1980s on. And what they're finding is that more than half of all banned books are by authors of color or ones that represent groups of viewpoints outside of the mainstream, right? So that's scary to think, right? That censorship is targeting people who are diverse, right? Whether that be based on sexuality, based on race, based on gender, based on political beliefs, right? That's who's being affected, right? And that's technically everyone, right? So that's, again, important to keep in mind. Okay, so some statistics that I think are important to go over, right? So again, as I mentioned, the ALA Office of Intellectual Freedom, OIF, receives reports from libraries, schools, and the media on attempts to ban books in communities across the country. And basically what they do is that every year they'll compile a list of books that have been challenged in order to inform the public about what's going on in terms of attempts of censorship in the community, right? So look at these numbers. Over this last decade, there have been over 5,000 challenges that were reported to OIF. That's a lot of challenges, right? Whether that be from parents, from school districts, right? These challenges are actively happening, right? And they're trying to affect the communities and how they're kind of giving access to literature to usually young children or young adults, right? And if you look at the breakdown of those challenges, you'll see that many are due to claims that the content is sexually explicit. Others cite offensive use of language. Others say that these texts are too violent. 361 challenges due to, quote, homosexuality, right? 274 materials were challenged due to occult or satanic themes. And under that is Harry Potter. 291 were challenged due to their religious viewpoint, and 119 because they were anti-family, right? So we see that the breakdown is, again, subjective, unclear, right? And there's a kind of a wide range as to why people want to challenge books, right? Because they don't like it for one of these reasons, right? Okay, so what I did earlier today is I passed out a couple of books that have been frequently challenged, and all of these books meet ALA's list of top 100 challenged books within the last decade. And what I would like to do is to have those of you who have the book in hand to tell me a little bit about the text, right? When you read it, why you thought it was important, and why you think other people should read it, right? So why is it important that we keep these texts in circulation and that we don't allow them to be banned from public schools or libraries, right? Okay, so who has Of Mice and Men? Raise your hand. Who's got it?
All right, so this is the book of Mice and Men, where you can see it. I didn't know they were banning this book. Well, challenging, sorry. And I was kind of feel struck by it. But I read this book. It's pretty cool in 9th grade in my sophomore year. And I can't remember much about the book, but throughout the whole book, it's pretty much about the journey of two men, maybe brothers, I'm not sure. My memory is foggy right now, but and how they struggle through life in search of a better lifestyle for both. And unfortunately, one of them is retarded, and he's special, and he loves this person very much, because you have no idea. When you read the book, this guy has so much patience towards him, and that shows how much love he has towards him. I enjoyed this book all the way through. Why? Because it was really interesting to read. personally, I hated reading at that time, but this book really defeated the idea. And why other people should read it? Well, um, there's a lot in this book going on in the background, and when you read the book, you don't only realize the historical background of it and the situation of the say poor class people, but also the values that go into it. And it's a worthwhile reading.
Okay, so you mentioned that, and I don't want to, well, I'll repeat the word that you used. So you mentioned that you hated reading the book at the time when you did. So
In general.
In general, okay.
Yeah.
So why is that the case? What about it did you not like? Or what did you find difficult about the reading?
Well, the reason I hated reading in general at that time.
Oh, in general.
In
You did
general.
not like reading. Okay, I see. I see
Yes.
what you mean. Okay, okay, excellent. So this book got you thinking then about important topics, right, and important issues. And you mentioned something along the lines of the working class in America, right, in the 1930s. You mentioned something about male friendship, right? So the text centers around the friendship between George and Lenny. And it's a very unique friendship, and it displays male friendship in a way that really wasn't represented in American literature up until that time, right? And it also deals with humanity, right? Empathy,
Yeah.
love, right? And I think that's a really important message that needs to be carried on, right, to other readers. And I think you make a good point of saying that it's important and other people should be reading it, right? Okay, so that's your take on it, right? However, people who have tried banning this book see it in a different way. So since the time of its publication, this book has been banned dozens of times, right? So every year it appears on ALA's list of top banned books. So it meets that 100 list of banned books every single year. And the reasons are wide and varied, from offensive language, racism, to violence, right? So again, we see some of the same repeated arguments over and over again when it comes to banning specific works of literature. And I also want to kind of explain how authors respond to these claims, right? And how they view their works of literature and why they want to fight against censorship, right? So John Steinbeck once said in an interview about his own writing that a writer out of loneliness is trying to communicate like a distant star sending signals. He isn't telling or teaching or ordering. Rather, he seeks to establish a relationship of meaning, of feeling, of observing, right? So again, here the author's trying to make a claim that he's not trying to indoctrinate anyone on any one point of view, right? Instead, what he's trying to do is establish a connection, right, between reader and author. And I think that's what a lot of these authors are trying to do, right? Establish some sort of connection, human connection, right? That is based on feeling and acceptance and not on rejection, right? Okay, great. So there's another text. So who has Fahrenheit 451? Excellent. So if you can go ahead and tell me a little bit about the book.
Hi, everyone. I'm not good at this. So Fahrenheit 451, I also read this middle school, I think. It's been a while. So forgive me if I kind of muddle some of the details, but it starts off with, everyone knows what a fireman is, but in this book it's something different. It's not someone who puts out fires, it's someone who actually starts them. Basically, it's a story about this guy who's a fireman, and he goes around burning books. And the reason it's titled that is because at Fahrenheit 451 is the temperature at which paper burns.
Mm-hmm.
So it's his discovery a little bit more about why they're banning books and how he gets integrated from the role of burning the books to kind of learning more about why they were burned and like some of the implications that came about, like why they started burning them and all the things that relate to that. I think it's an important book to read just because it's kind of one of those books that kind of make you think about the importance of the written word as it relates to all of us and like the information you can learn from these books, even if it is simple things. I think one of the main books that they burned was the Bible and the religious texts and all the implications that caused that. That's all I got.
No, great. Thank you. So you that was nicely put. So I'm not going to add on to anything that you've said. So Fahrenheit 451 was published in 1953, but it continues to be a challenge time and time and time again. So again, this book meets that list of 100 most challenged books over the last decade, right? And reasons for that is offensive language, inappropriate context, and religious views. And what Bradbury has to say in response to that is you don't have to burn books to destroy a culture, just get people to stop reading them, right? So again, the idea that, yes, book burning is one way that we get rid of books, right? But another way that we do that is to just get people to stop reading them. So we challenge books and we accept those challenges and we don't do anything about them. We're not too far from that dystopic world that the book takes place in, right? Okay. So who has Slaughterhouse-Five? Yes. Mm-hmm.
So this is Slaughterhouse-Five by Kurt Vonnegut, and it's about this man who serves in World War II, and he's actually kind of a joke of a soldier. He's not very strong or strong-minded, and he actually ends up surviving the war, but afterwards you can tell he kind of suffers from everything that happened. He's kind of delusional. He starts to believe in aliens and kind of changes into this completely different person. And I think the book is about like his life and like how, like what he wants to make of his life, because I think he was kind of this person who's been stepped on his whole life.
Mm-hmm.
His parents didn't even like, or his father wasn't very nice to him either. He almost let him drown in a pool. So I think it's like him like trying to find his own identity and his own happiness, and whether or not he really believes it, I think it kind of makes it sound like he really does believe what he's making up and what the aliens are telling him.
Mm-hmm.
I guess he's kind of like seeking out his own happiness. And I like the book because it, I thought it was kind of unique to have a protagonist that's like kind of different, I guess, like kind of weak, but I guess in some ways you can kind of relate to what he's saying. And then also it is actually, when it talks about World War II, it's actually very truthful and credible, because the author, Kurt Vonnegut, served in World War II himself.
Right.
And he kind of loosely based the events off of what happened to him. Not everything happened, but a lot of what happened in the book did happen to the author. So you learn a lot about World War II itself.
Okay, great. So for you, this book is important because it gives an honest or maybe personal perspective of the war, right? And you like the narrative style, right? So you also enjoy kind of getting that perspective from the narrator, right? And you like the overlaps that are happening between autobiographical writing and also fiction, right? And I think these are all kind of really important things that a lot of these great books that have been challenged are doing, right? They're doing a lot of these things right. However, they continue to be challenged, right? And again, we see reasons for this book that have been challenged are language, violence, explicit sexual scenes. And if you look at the date of publication, this book was published in 1969, right? And it continues to be a point of contention for readers today, right? So it's always important, I think, to think about why these books that are not really too contemporary to us continue to be challenged, right? What's the pushback? What message do would-be censors not want us to get, right? Because it goes beyond just, I don't like the book, right? What is the message that they're trying to stop, right? And in the author's response to censorship is that he hates that Americans are taught to fear some books and some ideas as though they were diseases, right? So again, the idea that censorship spreads like a disease, right? And that perhaps in our Puritan culture, we're taught to fear certain ideas, right? As much as we do an illness. Okay, so who has Beloved? Yep.
Hello, my name is Melanie. I'm an international business and business administration major. I read Beloved when I was a senior in high school for my AP literature class. So basically, Beloved is about the life of the main character, Seed. Mm-hmm. She ran away from slavery, and she had children. And the whole novel is based on Beloved, her daughter, who she, in this bout of like indescribable just fear for her children experiencing the same experiences that she had when she was a slave, she killed her child, buried her, and just like moved on. But of course the ghost came back. So the book is about the ghost just making appearances to her, kind of like tormenting her, like, why did you do this? Like her having to come to face the reality of everything that that she'd experienced and all that stuff. You guys should read it. So basically, I really love this book, especially because I don't know if you guys have an experience with this. When I was in middle school, in American history class, when I was taught about like the Civil War, slavery period of the United States, what I was basically thought was like, oh, it was economic. The whole fight was economic, and I was led to believe that. So I would put like it was a very like black and white issue, right? Slavery in the United States, until I read Beloved, and it was like these were real people. Like there was humanity in this and inhumanity in this entire act. Like it led me to have a perspective in which like this was not economic. Whoever says that does not have the entire picture. There's more to this that we are led to believe. So I really love this book. At the time I didn't like it because it gave me nightmares.
Okay.
So yeah.
Good. Excellent. Yeah. And I think you make a good point there, right? So that maybe at the time you didn't fully appreciate it, right? But I think that's the point of literature, right? Literature is supposed to make us uncomfortable. It's supposed to force us to think from a different point of view, right? To explore different ideas, different cultures. I think Beloved does a great job of doing that. And like you said, books are even capable of bringing history to life, right? So something that might seem very stark or very maybe matter of fact in a history book comes to life in a narrative, right? When you have a story that's being told, and especially one that's so powerful as Beloved, right? Okay, great. So we have one last one, and this is what we've been hinting at since the very beginning, and I see some smiles going up, so that tells me a lot of you have read Harry Potter, which makes me very happy. So Harry Potter has been banned so many times, I can't even number it for you. So from 1997, from its first publication to 2007, this book has been challenged over and over and over again, ranging from arguments that it promotes satanic themes, that it is anti-family unit, and that it is just way too violent, right? So those fights with wizards and Voldemort is just too violent for people, right? And I'd like to kind of touch on the author's response before we get to the person who's talking about the book, right? But what the author has to say in response to that, I think really touches at the heart of censorship, right? And that is that she has a real issue with anyone trying to protect children from their own imaginations, right? If we cannot acknowledge that a lot of us have a bit of darkness within ourselves, some more than others perhaps, and bring it into the light and examine and talk about it, this part of the human condition, then I think we will be living in quite a dangerous climate. I think that's much more damaging for children, right? So ignorance is not bliss, right? The idea that if we just don't let people read things, that they're going to be better off is not correct, right? And the idea that books are meant to have kids explore their imagination, right? Learn through other people's experiences, stories, right? Stories teach empathy, right? And they also, again, make us explore things that maybe we're not accustomed to talking about, right? But that's a great way to start the conversation, right? Books are supposed to be conversation starters, right? They're not supposed to just stop there, right? And I think that's what the author here is talking about. Okay, so who has Harry Potter? Who's got it? There we go. Okay, excellent. So tell me why you think this book is important and when you read it.
Okay, so as many of you probably have read this, I read this in middle school. I used to see the books in even elementary school. I told my mom that I wasn't going to read it because, I mean, the Order of the Phoenix was like the size of like a dictionary. But I got around to reading it, and once I did, I was I don't know. It kind of like opened up like a new like me. So I'm just gonna explain quickly what this book is about. It's about this boy wizard named Harry Potter. Initially, he lives in Privet Drive with his uncle, aunt, and cousin. And it's rather ironic that people try to ban this book for its magic. And the first page, it kind of describes how his family tries to seclude him from attending this school of magic, Hogwarts. So when I read this, when you read any piece of literature, you look at it through your lens. It's kind of like a mirror. It mirrors what you value, what you think. And for me, I really value imagination, creativity. It really spoke to me. And since I was a student, in school, and Harry Potter was going to attend school for the first time alone, that kind of spoke to me. Yeah, I related to that. And how he made friends with Ron Weasley and Hermione Granger, that also spoke to me, because the power of friendship, which I think is, one of the themes of this book, is just, it relates to a lot of people. So when you try to ban this book because it has themes of, which, satanic, it kind of, you don't have like a right to dictate to other people what you think and what is right and what is wrong. Like I said before, that once you start trying to define what it is, and how J.K. Rowling alluded to there, you kind of just, you try to take control of other people, and I don't think that's what we're about as humans. So I think this is an excellent piece of work. I could recommend it to you for various things, but the only way to find out why it's important is if you read it. So that's
Great, thank you for that lovely message. Yeah, and I think that you really touch on some really important points, right? The fact that going back to what Steinbeck said about literature, right? The point is to make a human connection, right? And how bizarre is it that you felt a personal connection to a wizard in training, right? But that's the beauty of literature, right? The fact that it opens us up to different worlds and it makes us connect on the most unlikely levels, right? And I think Harry Potter is just an excellent example of that, and clearly it touched you. So I think it's great that you spoke about it. Okay, great. Okay, so very quickly, I just want to go over some of the books that were challenged this past year, right? And I'd like for you guys to understand why, right? So here we have The Kite Runner, This One Summer, I Am Jazz, The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime, and Persepolis, right? All of these books are written by authors that identify themselves as part of a diverse group, right? So whether that be based on sexual orientation, whether that be based on issues of immigration, right? The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime deals with autism, right? So these are all kind of books that give voice to different parts of our community, right? So censorship tries to, once again, limit diversity, which is extremely problematic, right? So I'd like for you to kind of keep these thoughts in mind as we are kind of concluding our time here. But there's a lot that's at stake with would-be censors and book challenges, right? Democracy, right? So our democracy depends on our ability to have intellectual, informed conversations, right? So if we're taking books away from people, we're kind of hindering our ability to take part in democracy, right? Your First Amendment right? So I just want to take a second here and show you the fact that the First Amendment has been an issue not only in the New York Times, but just in culture as a whole for quite some time, right? And most recently because of the presidential election, right? And all the things that have been going on here, right? But a lot of people have been contemplating what the First Amendment means, right? And how that protects your point of view, right? And your freedom to express yourself, right? So again, just the fact that the New York Times decided to publish something that looks like this, right? Gives you an indicator that the First Amendment is only secured when you stand up for it, right? So it's something that's very relevant and timely, and that, of course, continues to affect us all, right? So it's important to be aware of your First Amendment right and to fight for it, right? To fight for your First Amendment. Censorship, of course, threatens diversity, originality, knowledge, communication, right? So we're kind of only allowing the points of view that we agree with to enter a conversation. That's not good, right? Because then we're talking to ourselves. And that's on the verge of insanity, right? Then we have, it's also kind of hindering communication, history, and of course, censorship has to do with power, right? So who gets to tell whose story? And that's also something that is important to remember. Okay, so what can you do about it, right? So I'd like to kind of leave you with some solutions to this problem that persists in American culture, right? So stay informed, right? So I'd like for you to take some time to browse FIU's Banned Books online library guide. And this was created by Beatrice Fernandez, who is a librarian here at FIU. Beatrice, are you here by any chance? Are you here? Thank you, Beatrice. Okay, so she right here is one of our librarians, and Beatrice took the time to compile some of the information that we've talked about here into a nice and tidy library guide. So go ahead and check that out if you have a moment. If you see attempts of censorship, you should definitely report it, right? The only way that ALA is able to keep track of these things is because someone tells them about it. Right. And there's actually a lot of different book challenges that go unaccounted for because people are just not reporting it. Right. So if you know of a sibling of yours that has encountered an issue like this in their school, you should definitely say something about it. Right. Because that's how we're able to compile this information. If you feel strongly about the issue, of course, you can become an advocate for just literature as a whole, right? So you can partner with other communities, other members of your community who oppose censorship. You can attend local hearings, right? So a lot of these hearings happen with school districts, right? So you can attend these hearings to see what the conversation is like. You can volunteer at your local library. And then, of course, you can write letters, but nowadays, who does that? So you can just send an email to your public officials encouraging them to preserve the right to read, right? And if you are feeling super excited about what I just talked about, which, of course, is what I'm going for, is that during the week of September 24th, you will attend a Banned Books Week event, okay? And you can do so here at FIU, right? So you can check out Banned Books displays in the Green and Hubert libraries. So you can just kind of walk through the library and look at books that have been banned and that they're in display for you and to take home with you if you so choose to do so. Or you can participate in a readout, right? So you can do so by virtually reading a book, right, and submitting it to ALA's YouTube channel. So you could film yourself reading an excerpt from your favorite book and explaining why it shouldn't be banned. You can take part in a live reading. And if you're feeling extra brave, you can do that on the 25th of this month at the Hubert Library. And they're actually having a graphic novel themed readout. And that sounds pretty neat. And I'm actually in the process of coordinating a reading for us here in the Green Library. So I'm envisioning something with some food involved in it, right? Some coffee and some good books, right? So I will keep you posted. I should have access to your email addresses. So if you're interested, I will be sure to forward you the information. But just kind of keep your eyes out for a book reading that will take place here in the Green Library within the week of the last week of September. Okay. All right, guys, and of course, celebrate your First Amendment right to read, right? So make sure that you guys are reading these great books. Those of you who have a book in hand that I passed out, I'd like for you to keep those and to pass them on to someone that you know that hasn't read the book, right? Because I think that's a really great way to kind of promote what we just talked about. All right. Thank you so much for being here again.
Produced by Academic Video Services within the Division of Information Technology at Florida International University.